Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Deirdre Chadwick. I am the Executive Director of Classical Music at BMI, the President of the BMI Foundation, and a Vice President at the National Music Council, which is bringing you this symposium today. I'm joined by three distinguished panelists on the topic of censorship in music. And I am going to ask them to introduce themselves now, beginning with you, Charlie Sanders. Please go ahead.
Well, I'm just going to give you the bullet points since I've been around for so long that it's a little overwhelming to try to break this down. But I started out as a recording and performing musician in New York in the 70s and as a concert producer at venues like Carnegie Hall and the United Nations. I served for decades as legal counsel to the National Music Publishers Association, and for the past 2 decades as counsel to the Songwriters Guild of America. I'm currently the chair of the National Music Council, and I'm on the board of the International Music Council, which Alfons chairs, and on the board of Fair Trade Music, and as advisor to Music Creators North America. Led Why Hunger, which is the social outreach group for the music industry, and have been an advisor to the Native American Music Association since its founding. I volunteered for the War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And for purposes of today, I'm also a 30-year professor of music history at NYU. And I'm the author of numerous books and articles about the history of music and its importance in social progress and upheaval in the past 3 centuries or so.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you for joining us. Next, I'd like to introduce Ole Reitov from Free Muse and coming to us from Copenhagen.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the invitation. I shall also try to make it brief. Originally, I was a music journalist that worked with the National Danish Broadcasting for about 30 years. In that work, I traveled most parts of the world and looked into the music industries, media policies, and so on and so forth, which led to an insight in the enormous amount of music censorship around the world, which made me and my wife to talk about, how come it that no one is doing anything for musicians? Because writers for many years had Penn International. So we started talking with people, and in 1998, we organized the first World Conference on Music Censorship in Copenhagen, got in people from various fields, researchers, lawyers, human rights activists, a lot of artists, of course. And most people said we need to have an organization. So we founded Free Muse, which then Free Muse is an abbreviation of Freedom of Musical Expression, which started then documenting as much as we could violations on freedom of musical expression worldwide. I worked with the organization up till 2017. I was the director from 13 to 17. Then I retired, and the retirement was about a week, and then UNESCO asked me to work a little bit more for UNESCO. So I work as a consultant for UNESCO and others on issues on artistic freedom worldwide. This includes training, workshops, papers, the usual stuff. I think that's in brief. And of course, in that work, we networked with a lot of people including Alfons, who's always been very strong on supporting these issues on artistic freedom and music censorship advocacy.
Thank you. Yes, and last we have Alfons Karabuda, composer and activist, and I'll let him describe his interaction with this topic.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. I'm Alfons Karabuda. I'm a composer. And I was raised in several countries by my parents, who were journalists and documentary filmmakers. And regardless of which country we were in, culture always played a significant role. And I saw firsthand the power of music and how it gave strength to people in despair, but also how this strength was terrifying for people in power, and to what extent they were ready to go to remove this power from artists they saw as enemies. As an example, we lived in Santiago de Chile for a couple of years, and we had to move very quickly just before the military coup. And there I got to experience how friends of my family, including Victor Jara, had to pay the highest price for using his music and lyrics to express himself. So that has never left me and is one reason for the many years I've spent on safeguarding and also advocating for cultural rights as a prerequisite for freedom of speech, for diversity, and as the very foundation for a democratic society. And presently, not only as a composer, but also as president of the International Music Council. And I'm also involved in a few other music organizations. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's start with you then, Alfons, because you mentioned the events in Chile in the 70s. And I think we should start with just exploring that idea of why among creative artists around the world, musicians and performing musicians and songwriters and composers are the most persecuted by repressive regimes. And can we talk more about where that power comes from and why it's so threatening?
Well, as I touched upon there, I think it's, in a way, it's simple because music touches everyone and almost everyone has music in their lives. So this is the one thing that can reach a whole country, a region, a world, and faster than much of the other cultural areas, I would say. So it is the power of touching others, teaching them, and inspiring them. And I guess that's the very reason. And I was taught, of course, my mother as a writer always told me, don't fight the kids in kindergarten, use your language, try to convince them. And that was how I was brought up. But with Victor Jara, I learned that that's not the case, for everyone. How they silenced him was very simple. For him not to play the guitar, you cut off his fingers, and for not, continuing singing, you cut off his tongue. And that was something that, that this is a world that I know Ole has been living in for, so many years and seeing what really happens. And most of the things we don't even know about. So, and we need to raise this awareness, but without, risking the lives of those being in danger. And it's a difficult task, but we need to be many more doing this, and especially also within the music, ecosystem and that we are a part of. So I'm very glad that we are discussing this here now.
Ole, do you have anything to add to that? I know that in your annual reports from Free Muse, it's obvious that musicians are the most at risk.
Yes, it seems like that. It seems like that. At least that's what we can document. But of course, with many art forms, you simply don't get the statistics, because, as Alfons said, music is such a public thing. It may be more easy to document. So normally, when Free Muse have done reports, we would try to say this is what we know, and there are a lot of things we don't know, and probably the problem is 10 or 100-fold larger than what you can actually document. But I think what's interesting to understand with music is that, if we go back to the old philosophers, Plato, he had ideas about the good and the bad. And I like to look into some of the arguments against music. And he said music is seductive. Yes, absolutely. It's absolutely seductive. And because it's seductive, it has to be controlled. And when you look into the history of music censorship, you basically come into all these arguments. Maybe we can come back to it a little bit later. But what's interesting about it is that there's been so many people, religious leaders, political leaders, people from civil society, who would find all kinds of arguments why music should be controlled, whether it's the music itself or whether it's music and the lyrics. And the strength of music is that you can pick up your instrument You can go somewhere. If you take the situation at Tahrir Square during the Arab so-called revolution that ended up in a disaster, someone like Rami Izam could travel from his village, go to Tahrir Square with his guitar, stand there, sing a song, and suddenly everyone was there. Everyone was singing. Everyone had the same feeling. And so music became a focal point during those demonstrations. And that's obvious why the regime had to fight back. They put him in prison, they tortured him. And today he's out of the country, like many other musicians that we worked with in the past.
Mhm. Yeah, that it's the unifying nature of a particular anthem that can be adopted by
Yeah,
the
which
people,
is
I think.
also, I mean, music can be used both ways. We know how regimes may use the music as a tool of propaganda. And it's interesting when they allow certain types of music and when they ban other types of music.
Mhm. Charlie, I know you had some thoughts about music as propaganda specifically. Do you want to pick up that thread?
Sure. I mean, first of all, I'd like to say that it's a true honor for me to be on this panel with the three of you. The amount of knowledge that you guys bring to the table on this issue is extraordinary, and I'm so pleased to be part of this. I think both Ole and Alfons hit the nail on the head in terms of talking about music's power. We spend a great deal of time, those of us who have devoted our lives to the music industry, talking about the commercial aspects of music and the artistic aspects of music. And frequently we ignore the most important element that drives both of those other things. And that is the power of music as a fire. It's a conflagration of emotions that can be used as a propaganda tool for good or evil. And we've seen it over and over and over again, repeated throughout history. Going back to ancient times and through the troubadours, the ability to use music as a portable propaganda device. And this both thrills and scares those in power to the point where, as Alfons so graphically and correctly pointed out, the level of violence visited upon Victor Jara, for example, was clearly intended as a message to the people of Chile by the Pinochet regime, that this is what we do to him, imagine what we're going to do to you. So all of these aspects of governance are loaded into the music issue. If the reason I'm here is to talk a little bit about the history. And so just for the start of that conversation, I have a thing called the bagpipe dichotomy that I like to raise with my students because I think it makes it a little bit easier for them to understand the emotions that we're talking about. The Knights of the Black Watch from the Highlands of Scotland have used bagpipes for hundreds and hundreds of years to instill courage, pride, etc., before going into combat. And, this is their thing. So two very, very famous incidents of the 20th century serve to illustrate the opposite ends of the spectrum. December 24th, 1914, after months of slaughter in the trenches of World War I, the troops on New Year's Eve begin singing to one another across the trenches on New Year's Eve. The German army sings O Tannenbaum, and the French, for the sake of argument, use Silent Night. But it was the bagpipers from the Highlands who began to play Amazing Grace, and who climbed out of the trenches and walked into no man's land, and were followed by the other two armies who, until hours before, had been absolutely eviscerating one another, and embraced and shared champagne and schnapps, and basically acknowledged the fact that they were humans who really wished that they weren't doing what they were doing. And we could say that it was Christmas time and that that's what did it. I believe in my heart that the music was really what made it possible for them to get out of the trenches and to do that. Flash forward to June 6, 1944. The Knights of the Black Watch, as always, have volunteered on D-Day to be in the first wave of combat. And they are given explicit instructions to leave the pomp and circumstance behind. When they landed next to Omaha Beach at Sword, expecting the kind of resistance that they met, and the Higgins boats dropped their doors to allow the troops out, it was, of course, a bagpiper who walked out into the surf and who miraculously survived. What were the reactions of the government in those two instances? In the second instance, the bagpipers were revered and became legendary for the courage that they had shown, and that the music became a rallying point for millions of people around the world as a display of courage in the face of evil and danger. In the aftermath of what happened in the First War, almost every person who participated in the Christmas truce was either court-martialed or sent into another combat sector where they were almost sure to be injured or killed, because the government could not have that kind of power usurped by individuals in a way that violated what the government was trying to accomplish. We have to keep in mind in evaluating why music is so powerful. I think those two examples, because they so closely parallel one another, but the results of each one of them are mirror opposites of one another. So again, being informed about what has gone on in the past in terms of the power of music as a propaganda tool, whether it was in the US Civil War for good or as part of a Nazi regime for evil, it is a propaganda tool of overwhelming power, and it evokes very, very strong reactions in governments throughout the world. And in order to properly respond, it's, I think, incumbent upon all of us in the music community to be educated about what has happened in the past, to know how better to handle it in the future.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I add something there, Deirdre? Is it okay? Thank you, Charlie. I mean, it's such a strong story. It really is incredible. I just wanted to add one thing to this, and that is the fact that some of our colleagues are not doing what they are doing because they are heroes. They might not even want to be heroes. Sometimes their message might be written or sung before it actually was forbidden or dangerous. Mm-hmm. And it still has a life after that. So we do have a lot of colleagues that also involuntarily has become idols or someone to look up to without even wanting it, which I'm just raising that to show the complexity also of you can't even choose not to be at risk sometimes because you don't even know that you're going to end up in it.
Right. Good point. I mean, that's when you create music, you're not in control of the life that it has once it leaves you. So yes, good point there.
Exactly.
You can become a symbol without meaning to.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what happens to many of the artists that I worked with in the past, that it's just when they get in the situation that they realize that what they have been creating is endangering their life. Charles was mentioning Nazism, and I think it's interesting to look into the ideologies and how they operated in this landscape of music censorship. And as we know, Stalin and also Hitler were very interested in music. It's just certain kinds of music they absolutely didn't like. But if you look at, let's see, just these two ideologies, if we can call it that, there's so many similarities in their arguments against music and certain types of music. And I probably, Charles can talk much more about it. But I mean, modernism was one of the key words that I mean, it was against the people in Soviet Union, and in Nazi Germany, it was the same. I mean, it affected several of the modernist composers like Hindemith and Schoenberg, because that was not according to how proper German culture should be. And when we look at the effects, because I mean, we can talk about many of these arguments, but who were affected by it and what kind of music was affected by it. Now in Nazi Germany, it was not only the classical modernist, it was also jazz musicians. It was jazz music because jazz music was black music and it was totally against the racial policies of the country. And then Roma people, because Roma people were almost like Jews. And then, of course, all Jewish composers. One of the effects was obviously that those who were able to leave the country, especially to the US, became very famous composers as well there and started working into other kind of industries. So when we talk about music censorship, there's some complexities here, because for some people, it can actually become a new start, Shostakovich or whoever, whereas for some people who are forced to leave their country, it's more or less the end of their career because their audience are at home.
If not their life.
Yeah, exactly. But the very fact that a certain type of music, just the way it's being composed or the way it sounds, has been used against the music, like the Soviet Union would say it's atonal, and the same in Nazi Germany. Any atonal music should be banned, and so many parallels from the political landscape to the religious landscape. Now, I mentioned earlier Plato, just sort of, for the history of it. But if you look some of the arguments that has come forward, one was music is unfavorable to health. Now, where did that came from? That came from George Fox, founder of the Quaker movement, because in the beginning, the Quakers absolutely banned all types of music. So when we talk about Afghanistan today and the Taliban, we need to also to look into the Christian societies and other religious societies of their traditions of banning music and the reasons for banning it. So we only have to go back to the 18th century in Sweden, for instance, where Alfons is now. It's my neighboring country. Christian missionaries would travel to the northern parts of Sweden and tell the fiddle players they should burn the instruments because it was a tool of the devil, which is absolutely the same arguments we hear in Afghanistan today.
And I did want to segue more into the ways in which the various churches around the world or religious movements have also banned music or censored music on grounds of whether it's sexual pureness or whether it's other kinds of degenerate fear of degeneracy or whatever. And we see sort of political and religious united in countries like Afghanistan, but I think there are more local examples in the US. And we don't talk much about censorship in the US, but would one of you like to speak more about that history?
Yeah, I'll just add one thing because Charles knows much more about this. But I mean, during the McCarthy periods in the 50s, where all communists or everyone who was considered communist were banned or whatever, there was an actual travel ban for American musicians to leave the country. and of course, many of them were marginalized. I'll just add one more thing because I know Charles can add a lot more to this. But let's just think about the situation when the Dixie Chicks in 2003 were criticizing the invasion in Iraq. Hundreds of radio stations banned their music. They basically went out of business for 2-3 years, and it took a long time before some of the Democrats in Nashville came forward and started sort of protecting or saying, we need to discuss this. And that's a very recent history. And I'm quite sure that if anyone would stand up in the current crisis in war on Ukraine and start talking peace, it would be very, very difficult for a Ukrainian musician to do that without comparing the situation to 2003.
Charles, do you have more to add on that?
Well, Deirdre, I think that you used the word degeneracy, which comes up so frequently in these discussions, and the Nazi regime and the Stalin regime, as Ole pointed out, both use that concept to ban music, certain types of music, as well as other art forms. I think that you see a continuation of that theme, again, past being prologue in all things, that rock and roll in the United States and in Eastern Europe during the Cold War was subject to various bans, as was mentioned, and restrictions for exactly the same reason. The fear that it was going to unleash social change that the regimes in power did not want to see. I think one of the extreme ironies that we deal with when we're discussing the reaction of pushing back against this anti-degenerate movement is, as in the case of the Nazis, which used the Horst Wessel theme, which was the SS anthem, as a tremendous rallying point. Leni Riefenstahl used it in Triumph of the Will, and many other films depicted it as being the song that all Nazis stood up for and gave the salute. Has been banned now for 70 years in Germany and Austria. I guess that there's a certain irony in that. There's an irony in the fact that Hatikva, the Israeli national anthem, which is based on Smetana's Moldau, written way over 100 years ago, was banned by the British in Palestine. We see antidotes being applied that would seem to fly in the face of the freedoms that we're espousing, against those who banned other music in the first place. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle or circle, if you like. But I think, Alfons and Ole have pointed out the complexities of this issue are so deep and entangled that it really does take a great deal of time to tease apart a blueprint for policy going forward as to how we want to handle hate speech, how we want to address religious groups that claim it is their freedom of religion to lash out against degenerate type music. There are points on both sides that unleash very emotional responses in people, and it's a very delicate area. And again, as Alfons is very keen on reminding all of us correctly, rushing headlong into any of these issues without very careful planning, thought, and review of what can go wrong in terms of bringing greater danger to those who are in danger already, has to be a key in our analysis as to what to do in each and every one of these individual instances.
Thank
And
you
I
for
couldn't
that.
agree more.
Yeah,
Sorry,
please,
I,
Go
I,
ahead.
and I just have to raise and focus a bit on free music, which I mean, of course, Ole, you are the co-founder, but what you have done with free music has been so important in us not sitting somewhere else in Sweden or Denmark thinking that we know what the situation is in different countries and regions. We need to have the network, as Primus also has had and has now, locally, in knowing. Without that, without the local knowledge, you will never be able to know what to do, and sometimes even maybe helping the wrong persons in this. So it's an incredibly difficult task, and I'm very glad, as part of the musical ecosystem, that we have organizations like Freemuse, but we need to strengthen them more.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And Ole, do you want to, I mean, we talked a little bit offline about just, and you've mentioned it already, the difficulty in collecting these statistics and really finding out what the situation is for individuals on the ground. Do you want to talk a bit more about that?
No, absolutely. Also because there's a lot of self-censorship. It's something that few artists want to talk about. Whenever I've asked musicians whether they want to talk about it, there are very few. One is a very famous rapper in Senegal, and he was very open about it and said, yes, of course I self-censor because I need to take in consideration the society I live in. And that's said by a musician who is very political and has been very strong in politicizing young people in Senegal. But what's interesting is also that it changes over time. So many years ago, he said, well, I can't talk about the religious leaders. That's one thing. I can talk about politics. Before, I couldn't talk about wife beating. Now I can talk about that. So there are certain social contexts where you can talk about these issues. But the problem is, I think that to understand the complexity of the mechanisms, and we tried to do that from the beginning, is that you need to have some kind of interdisciplinary method. And as an example, in 2005-06, I think we made a conference in Beirut with artists, lawyers, and also an Islamic religious scholar. Because as Charles said, you need to understand why people have the idea they have about bands and music and so on and so forth. But very few get into that kind of dialogue, unfortunately, also locally. They talk parallel to each other, and I think they're parallels to this whole cancellation culture that we see now. But you need to do that, and once you start doing it, that's when it becomes really interesting, because then you may understand why people have these ideas. So, for instance, this scholar who had a gold medal, Islamic scholar, would start by saying 80% of the arguments against music are false. There's no background to them at all. And then you can look into, let's say, the hierarchy of what is allowed and what is banned. I think it was in the 80s that Lois El-Farouki, who was an Islamic scholar professor in the US, made an article on music and Islam, and she looked into the hierarchy on ban. Obviously, if you just chant the Quran, this is not considered music. But the further you get down to, let's say, the use of music as lullabies or marches or whatever, you get to a certain point where this becomes a discussion amongst the scholars. And so, like with political ideologies, you have those who are complete fundamentalists, and then you have those who said, no, let's wait a minute here. That's not really how we should interpret, whether it's what's in the Quran itself or in the Bible, but also in the sayings of the Prophet and the practices and so on and so forth. And that's when it's become interesting, because when you start arguing against those fundamentalists who believe that there should be a complete ban on music, then you can get into that kind of discussion through a theological background, and then you also need to talk about international conventions, what international conventions, and you know, what are we respecting? Is your country respecting those international conventions that you've actually ratified? Or should you, because you are a religious leader or political leader, believe that you have more power, more right to implement your ideas of why music should be banned? And it's very complex, and it confuses a lot of artists. I've spoken to many artists in Muslim countries who have such a rich musical heritage and so many genres, but even young musicians have been sort of, what can I do? What can I not do? Because it's not really been discussed in the open, and it's not being lectured in any universities or any arts educations.
But isn't that lack of clarity part of the control too? If people don't know what they're allowed to do, they may not
That's
walk
one
up to the
thing,
line,
obviously.
right?
That's obviously, I mean, those places where you have outright censorship systems, like take the example of the Kano state in northern Nigeria. Nigeria has obviously a national legislation, but then the local states implement it differently. Kano has since the past 20 years had a music censorship board, and it's rather transparent. I mean, you submit a proposal to make a concert, and they will look into it, they'll look into who you are, what you're doing. If they grant you the right to perform, they would also try to protect you. But then, of course, they cannot always protect you against Boko Haram and other terror groups. But at least there is some kind of transparency. In Egypt, there is no transparency at all. And the worst part of it is that those who are put into the situation of controlling the musicians are musicians themselves. So that's another situation we've seen over time in many countries, that artists have been part of the state system of depriving the rights of some of their colleagues to perform, sometimes from ideological backgrounds, sometimes from pure career and financial backgrounds to promote their own career.
And maybe more so now, Ole, when we look back at history, and this is a good thing, obviously, the perception of censorship, I believe, in most countries is different now. We don't see it as automatically a good thing, but back then in the ancient societies, it was really considered as legitimate instrument for regulating moral and political life of the population, and everyone felt that good. This is how we, keep it clean and everything right. And I don't think most of us have the same feeling right now.
Yeah, I think that's true. Certainly, the self-censorship issue is a very important one to consider, and I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk very briefly anyway about the brilliance of certain artists who have used coding in the past in their lyrics and sometimes in their musical composition to get the ideas across that if they were expressed in a more blunt way would get that person killed. To me, the best example of that is the US Civil War, where the Confederacy made it a capital crime to speak about anti-slavery and to distribute any information that could be construed as abolition type material. The only book that the slaves were allowed to look at was the Bible. And so the songwriters and creators in the African American slave community began making the analogy to slavery in Egypt. And you have songs that have survived now for, almost 200 years, like Let My People Go, like Gospel Plow, in which the ostensible nature of a song is celebrating a Bible verse or a Bible story, but the words of Mary, don't you weep, end up with the refrain, oh Mary, don't you weep and moan, Pharaoh's army got drowned, oh Mary, please don't weep. That's pretty much the same as saying we're going to kill you. But it's coded, and that self-censorship is demonic in nature in terms of undermining the ability to communicate what ideas creators want to express through their art. But there are ways around it, and they have been brilliantly used in the past in ways that were so effective then that you see films still making reference to it. We saw Martin Luther King make one of his most famous speeches about the various slave songs, including "We Shall Overcome," as being instrumental in the movement, as being 100 years old. So the power and the resonance of using metaphors and analogies to avoid self-censorship is another very important aspect of this week that we can learn from and educate members of our community about, to take pride in, that we move culture forward by moving around the barriers that were placed by governments. So I think
I'm sorry, I just got so many associations when you talked about this, Charles, because one thing that came up was, the list that came out during 9/11, because of course many broadcasters panicked, so they started looking into all the songs. One of the songs that were recommended not to play was "Bridge Over Troubled Water." Another one, "Give Peace a Chance," and the whole thing about those who are censoring or controlling music is that they have to use their imagination, which is why, for instance, in South Africa during apartheid, the South African broadcasting had 13 rules, and one of them was actually lyrics may inflame public opinion. And exactly what Charles said, if you made even a referral to the Bible, it could be misunderstood as "we want a revolution, so let's better ban it," which in those days when they were playing vinyls, they would actually scratch that particular track on the vinyl. So you'll find vinyls in the archive of SABC where 2 or 3 tracks had scratched, and the rest were allowed to play. And I think what's difficult sometimes, and we've tried to do this in our work, to have that dialogue with censors. How do you understand the situation? And I can refer to during the Second World War in Denmark, when Denmark was occupied by the Germans, there was a censor called Mr. Norman. He understood what the Germans did not understand. And he would invite Danish composers, especially with cabaret lyricists, to say, "Look, I can't let this go through, but if you formulate it this way, the Germans are not going to understand it." And exactly what Charles talked about, the double meaning, double entendre, which we of course have seen in so many great songs.
But there's another angle to this, and I heard this from a colleague, a visual artist, trying to get a permit to stay in Sweden. And he showed his work to one of those working at the authorities that was going to see are you really painting dangerous stuff? Is this, do we need to save you? And this person at the authorities said, well, probably no, because they're so beautiful. They're so aesthetically beautiful, the paintings. So for her, it didn't matter that they had all of this symbolism that was extremely dangerous to this person, because you couldn't see that it had the meaning was twofold. It could be beautiful and it could be very dangerous. It was remarkable then.
I think it's so interesting too, these examples all illustrate something that's been on my mind, which is that artists are often repressed for their art, but they're also often leading protests, leading demonstrations, and that these are people who are very passionate about human rights and passionate about freedom. And somehow there's a huge overlap between that type of person, that character type, and someone who really wants to express these things in these higher mediums. And I just find that such a fascinating overlap. I noticed it, Ole, in your report, and also just it's coming out in this conversation. This, I don't want to talk about that, about musicians and artists as principled leaders in this area.
It's a huge discussion also among some of the artists, that some artists would not like to see them automatically as human rights defenders. There was a report some years ago by UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights about artists as human rights defenders. So depending on how you look at it, I mean, as a human rights defender, you would see that they're promoting human rights, but maybe they don't want to see themselves basically as human rights defenders. They want to see themselves as artists. But as you point to, this is one of the complexities when you make statistics, because when you had all these artists who were imprisoned in Turkey during demonstrations, they were, in the front line. But were they particularly imprisoned because they were well-known artists or because they were activists? And I don't think there is a simple answer to it, because in previous years, there were incidents where some artists, especially musicians, were picked up during demonstrations because the police knew that they were voices for Kurdish minorities or whatever. But I think in a huge demonstration where it's even dark and there are hundreds of people and artists happen to be there, then are they arrested because they're artists? And it's something that I think any organization dealing with defending artists or human rights defenders really need to distinguish between these things when it's possible to do. It's quite different when people are put on trial because of their songs. But there are a lot of artists, and obviously this is where many rappers in Africa today get problems, because they become sort of the voice of many young people, and it's easy to target them. They obviously see themselves as activists or oppositionists in those societies.
Yeah, Ole, I think that's absolutely true, that there is a class, to answer Deirdre's question, of artists who are of such courage that they are willing to label themselves as activists. Yeah, I mean, certainly Bob Marley, with songs like Get Up, Stand Up, a very good example of that. But, I mean, Woody Guthrie in the 1930s, at a very dangerous, volatile time, wrote on his guitar, "This machine kills fascists." And the same with Pete Seeger, who I knew very well. He wrote on his banjo, "This machine surrounds hate and forces it to surrender." When they showed up at union rallies, whether it was in coal country or elsewhere, and saying, "Which side are you on?" they were placing their lives in danger. There is no question about it. And they did so proudly. And I think that, coming out of a Harry Chapin organization as I did, he took another tack in terms of using music proudly as a way to raise money and to fight hunger. But there certainly is a class of musicians, songwriters, composers, etc., who do fall into the category of, one of the reasons why we do what we do is to change people's minds, is to make a difference in this world and make it a better place. So, yeah, I think there's that. And I also want to add a third category, which, if we have time, we may want to discuss. And that is the class of creators who are coerced to cooperate with the government and to create against their will art that supports ideas that they do not necessarily believe in. And we saw that most blatantly in the United States at the time of World War I, where Douglas MacArthur, who was the very first Army public affairs officer, literally went down to Tin Pan Alley in New York and spoke to many of the immigrant songwriters, people like George M. Cohan, people like Irving Berlin, and reminded them that they were guests here in this country. And wouldn't it be nice if they wrote some patriotic songs to help in the effort to draft people into the Army when the US intervened in that war in 1917. So again, the levels of complexity in peeling this onion back are extraordinary. But it's good to have a survey of all of the aspects of this in order to frame what we hope are blueprints for going forward.
It reminds me of a conversation I had with South African trumpet player Hugh Masekela. Obviously, he went into exile, and when he was in the US, a representative from South Africa came forward to him and said, you can come back, we're not going to ban you, we can provide you with great facilities and whatnot, which was obviously appealing. He had a long conversation with Harry Belafonte, and Harry Belafonte told him, if you really want to make a change for your country, you stay out of the country because you can make much more noise here. And that, of course, is difficult things with being in exile. I don't know what's happening in the background. If you hear any bombings, probably New Year, that it's getting too late here. Because I work with quite a number of musicians, and of course Alfons know them also, who are in exile, and they obviously want to address the audience at home. So it's difficult to create sometimes a new career in the country they are getting into. And so all these organizations that deal with artists at risk and hostings of these very fast get into that complexity of what can you do for them? Because of course, if your life is in danger, you want to leave the country. But what happens to your career then? And then there are all the commercial interests, and there are all these issues. We haven't talked about the internet yet. But yeah, there are a lot of challenges.
Yeah. I mean, we talked earlier about self-censorship and sort of different angles of that particular phenomenon. But Alfons, I know you were also speaking of present day and the internet, and just market forces are also at work. And did you want to speak a little bit, Alfons, about that kind of self-censorship too?
Yeah, I think it's important because it's not always as visible. And if we see what the present censorship, what differs from the past ones, I would say that all the past ones still exist, but we can add on with the present one. Unfortunately, I'm sorry to say that, but the new ones on, the digital ones are added on with a regional limitless of the abuse of freedom of speech. And it's often with the help of technology, and it's run by very few, very powerful platforms or gatekeepers owning the windows to the audience or citizens. And I think this is very important when we talk about freedom of speech, that it's not just about your right to express yourself, but the right for you to actually reach your audience, to have the doors open to society, to the citizens, and also, of course, including a fair remuneration for your work as a professional, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to continue with the work that sometimes can be criticizing someone or not. And it's a very effective way of silencing those that you see as an opponent. And I think here, representing my colleagues, as also Charlie does when it comes to authors' rights, copyright, and this is something that we see increasing now, that the use of authors' rights, copyright, or cultural rights to silence others, or taking the power from the creators. So not by weakening the copyright, but instead wanting them and coercing creators into giving them or selling them for a low cost, which kind of reduces their power. They don't have the power over their own creations. And this limits the diversity and the multitude of voices. So I think this is extremely important. And this is one, we have talked about political censorship, also religious, but there's a market-driven one, and it's extremely powerful. And when you talk, of course, Charlie, you know much more than me about this, but if we compare countries, I would say, maybe wrong, but there are certain countries, I can look at Sweden, for example, I see that colleagues have maybe a bit more access to stipends, prizes, and opportunities to maybe create under circumstances that are a bit, not so much forced under the laws of the market. So Deirdre, when you asked, what's special about the US, well, I guess that the US has an even more problematic situation with this kind of censorship, because you have to fit in order to survive, and that interferes in what kind of content or art that you actually are creating. So I think this is something that we need to take very seriously. And just to add on as a last thing, there are no public spaces in the digital sphere. And this is very important. Sometimes we're led to believe that there are, but there are no public spaces. And this hinders artistic freedom, and it forces us to conform to all the policies that are forced upon us by these big players. Often, me not being a lawyer, but I think that even lawyers probably sign a lot of these contracts from the platforms that comes up on the screen, and you have 80 pages of something. We simply cannot cope with it. So this is a very difficult situation, and where self-censorship is unfortunately sometimes dominating in order to get on. The windows that I talk about is, of course, playlists often. And the playlists, you actually buy yourself onto that, and only the big corporates can afford that. So the creators and performers cannot afford buying their own freedom of speech over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Deirdre, I think that Alfons makes great points there.
Yeah.
And the commercial pressure is an aspect of this that cannot be overlooked. I want to drop one quick footnote, because it's sometimes overlooked, and Ole so rightfully brought up Hugh Masekela. We would be terribly remiss not to mention so many of the women of color who have been part of the movement to fight back against this kind of repression. Miriam Makeba comes to mind immediately as the partner of Hugh in going into exile and attempting to use her own popularity. But people like Nina Simone, and people even up to and including Moms Mabley, the famous Black comedian, whose version of Abraham Martin and John may have been one of the most effective recordings in the civil rights movement. So inclusivity is something, in terms of storytelling in this area, that we are all keenly aware of, and we don't want to overlook the courage and actions of any one individual or group.
Right. I mean, one of the problems with the US, we think of it as being free, but to Alfons's point, I mean, marginalized groups within the US really can't get a foothold. And especially now, we have massive aggregation on the publishing side, massive aggregation on the digital platform side, and very few ways in for independent artists who are trying to get their voices heard.
It takes a lot of courage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I guess I'd just like to wrap up at this point, unless there's something else that you think we should be speaking about. I'd like to just ask each of you if there, one thought you might want to leave our audience with today on this topic. And Alfons, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, I'll continue with technology, but I realized that I might have seemed very negative and without hope. And I don't want to end the panel in that way. So, because it's on the contrary, for the reason, if technology is the reason for growing censorship in one way, I also believe that it can be the key and a solution for a more inclusive and global society, and for the multitude of voices. So this is something I look upon very positively. And in terms of the optimist, I would say that I believe in a time where technology and art join forces together with us in the musical community. And because no matter what the society, what kind of route the society takes, it is certain to be driven by creativity. And I mean, you hear that I'm a fan of technology, but without creativity, technology is nothing. But without technology, we still have music and art. So we, art and music will be the winners and the long-term winners.
Thanks. Charlie?
I would just, say that forging a better future depends upon an understanding throughout the music community of the past, which is prologue. We must learn from what's taken place in the past, what worked and what didn't, in terms of making a more free, open, productive, and fair society. And that begins by educating ourselves through whether it's university programs or just speaking about it on panels like this, or at cocktail parties for that matter, about the courage and inspiration that we can draw from what's taken place in the past, and how to better frame how we react to problems in the present and future to forge a better music community and a better world.
Thanks. And
can I change my mind and say what Charlie said?
I think there are many ways to wrap this up.
I'll switch to Alfons.
I'm grateful for all of these voices here. Ole, do you have a final thought for us?
Yeah, I'm optimistic and pessimistic at the same time, because optimistic in the sense that musicians have always survived these things and they find ways distributing. I think I mentioned it in an earlier discussion that you can kill the song, you can kill the musicians, but you cannot kill the songs. It can travel all over. What's my pessimism? It's that there seems to be the situation in current societies that we don't really want to tackle some of the difficult issues. The boycott on all Russian artists, which has been implemented in some countries, is absolutely ridiculous, because we don't want to see the nuances in this. All the cancellations in arts communities and whatnot. We've seen how universities panic, get rid of professors because they have done something that one student reacted to. Get into the dialogue, take the discussion. You don't need to offend. You have the right to offend. You don't need to do it, but you can at least discuss why certain people are being offended by this and that. And so, in a way, whether we go back to Plato or the Taliban or whatever, there still seems to be so many people who feel that they have more right to control others and what others express. And that's very tricky if we don't tackle it in a very open discussion. This includes also all the arts councils who are handing out money, who are now sort of, okay, maybe this is a little bit too controversial to give through that, so we avoid that. Difficult discussions, we need to put them forward. We need to take those discussions, also like Charlie talked about previously, how do we deal with hate speech and all these issues? Not easy, life is not easy, but it's also fantastic with all the music we have in the world.
Thank you. And thank you so much for your time today. This is such a deep and nuanced and fascinating topic. I feel like we could go on for another hour, but we are out of time. Thank you so much to Ole Reitov, Charlie Sanders, and Alfons Karabuda for joining us today. Thank you to the audience for your attention, and hope to see you again here soon.
And thank you to you, Deirdre, for doing such a great job in moderating.
Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you for putting up with me. It was wonderful.